IVM.
Yuddha is for adults. It contains graphic depictions of violence against humans and animals. If you feel you'll be triggered by the accounts of violence in this podcast, it's best you skip through those bits. That said, on to the episode. 1,000 years ago, an upheaval came to the Indian subcontinent as armies of nomads stormed into the plains in search of plunder and glory. 300 years after this upheaval, the sun rises on a subcontinent transformed. The great empire of the Turks is falling, and it's two new powers in the Deccan that are delivering the mortal blows. This is the story of those two powers. As always, it's the story of the collision between the gradual and the momentary, a story of individuals and of societies, a story of destruction and creation. It's the 23rd of February, 1346, and there are chants and celebrations echoing from the monastery of Sringeri, nestled in the misty hills of Chikmagalur. Inside stand 5 brothers, the sons of Sangama. As the priests chant and the smoke from the sacred fire rises, the brothers cannot help but reflect on the turns fortune has taken them through. The Sangama brothers are scarred and battle-hardened. Their eyes shine with ambition, but also with the darkness of those who have seen the horrors of war. Also with them, chanting and spooning ghee into the fires, is a man painted with the camphor symbols of the orthodox Sri Vaishnava sect. His name is Vijayanagara, and with the support of his network of monasteries, the brothers are establishing themselves as legitimate rulers. One of them, Harihara, is now king. The brothers are no longer family now. They are a dynasty, and they will rule their hard-won kingdom from a place called the City of Victory, Vijayanagara. 18 months after this solemn ceremony, another king is rising, 500 miles to the north. In Daulatabad, the man some would call Hassan Gangu is crowned Sultan Alauddin Hassan Bahman Shah. Newly crowned, Bahman Shah now strides into the mosque in his new capital. He wears an opulent robe gifted to him by the Sufi sheikh Zain al-Din Shirazi, an immigrant from Persia. And it is no ordinary robe. It was once supposedly worn by the Prophet Muhammad himself during his ascent to heaven. With the support of popular sheikhs like Shirazi, Bahman Shah will rule not as a petty governor, but as a sultan in his own right. He will be the head of something that history has not seen before, an independent sultanate in the Deccan. Like Harihara, Bahman Shah has carved out his realm by revolting against the Delhi Sultans. But having smashed the power of Delhi, Vijayanagara and the Bahmani Sultanate now turn to face each other. Their clash will determine the fate of the subcontinent. Welcome to Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast. I'm Aditya Ramanathan.
And I'm Anirudh Kanisati. Over the course of the last few episodes, we've seen as Delhi, this once provincial backwater ruled over by ambitious Turkic slave sultans who were battling each other as they battled the other peoples of India, slowly rise to become the dominant military power of the subcontinent, leading spectacular invasions all the way to the deepest south of the subcontinent in campaigns that would have made Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola proud. But we also saw how the peoples of the Deccan were not exactly easy to rule over. We've seen how the ambitious, intelligent, and totally inhumane Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq attempted to create a new kind of revenue extraction apparatus in this wealthy land in order to fund his campaigns into Central Asia. And we've also seen that it didn't really work out that well for him. The way that Muhammad bin Tughlaq went about doing this was by establishing, for perhaps the first time in India's history, colonies of North Indians and Turkic peoples in a network of garrison towns in the Deccan, which would turn into hard currency the enormous amount of revenue that is extracted from the erstwhile wealthy kingdoms of the Deccan. But we've also seen how, through a policy of just general strategic overreach and absolute brutality, he managed to alienate many of these settlers, who eventually led a revolt against him, which led to the rise of this man that we know as Sultan Alauddin Bahman Shah. But there's another interesting aspect of Bahman Shah's power, which, as you can see from Aditya's description, also paralleled what was happening south of the Krishna River, where Tughlaq authority had existed only through the subjugation of chiefs such as the Sangama brothers. This was the fact that Sufi sheikhs for the very first time were migrating into the Deccan. If you look at the campaigns of Alauddin Khilji and Malik Kafur and even Muhammad bin Tughlaq's early campaigns in the Deccan when he was still called the Prince Ulugh Khan, there was something that set the Deccan apart from Delhi, something very, very important. This was the fact that there were no, as far as we know, very large or well-established Muslim peoples in the cities of the Deccan. But now, after barely a decade or so of Tughlaq rule, a very large number of Sufi sheikhs who were very important to the self-construction of Delhiites as Muslims and as Indian Muslims had begun to migrate to the Deccan. This meant that technically the Deccan was no longer the Dar al-Harb. It was no longer not a part of the Islamic world. It was no longer an area that these Muslim kingdoms could just unleash violence upon and face absolutely no political or moral backlash for. The migration of Sufi sheikhs, such as Sheikh Zain al-Din Shirazi and another sheikh known as Gisu Daraz, established that the Deccan was no longer to be considered Dar al-Harb. In fact, it was now Dar al-Islam. It was also home to Muslims. And this meant that fundamentally the kind of approach that this new kind of sultanate, the Sultanate of Alauddin Bahman Shah, would approach the Deccan in a very different way. It was no longer out to simply loot and sack and kill. It was out to be a kingdom like any other, a kingdom just like that of the Sangamas. It might be illuminating to kind of dive into this parallel a little deeper. You may have noticed that the sound of traffic and of pigeons cooing is integral to my voice track now that I'm sitting and recording Yuddha episodes at home. Similarly, an equally integral aspect of power for these new Deccan polities that were rising now was the support of these religious elites. Just as Sufi sheikhs helped transform Bahman Shah's regime that was merely a provincial governorship in rebellion against Delhi into a kingdom in its own right. The sage Vidyaranya, who Aditya mentioned as existing in Sringeri at this time, was an integral aspect of the power of the Sangama brothers. Now, of course, Vijayanagara, I'm sure for a lot of our listeners, is not exactly something that's new. Vijayanagara is, by all accounts, an absolutely legendary city. The most famous tale of the founding of Vijayanagara is that two of the Sangama brothers, Harihara and Bukka, happened to be hunting around a hill when they saw something quite remarkable. One of their hunting dogs was running straight at them, being chased by a fearsome creature, a rabbit. This was, as you can imagine, something that both these brothers found rather surprising, and they explored the hill a little further, at which point they discovered a sage sitting there in meditation. This sage introduced himself as Vidyaranya. He supposedly claimed that any city founded on this magical hill where the weak defeated the strong would eventually rise to become a great empire. This is very clearly meant to be an analogy for the Delhi Sultanate, which had basically been like a hunting dog towards all the rabbits that were the kingdoms of the Deccan in the previous century, in the last 50 years or so. And the brothers settled down, built a city there, and of course became these great Hindu conquerors who defeated all these evil Muslims, as the stories go. But there's also many other stories that go into the foundation of Vijayanagara, all of which involve in various ways this sage, this Vidyaranya. In one version of the story, both Harihara and Bukka are captains who served under the rulers of Kampali, or in some versions, the Kakatiya kings, who were defeated and taken to Delhi after the collapse of their respective overlords' kingdoms, converted to Islam, and were then sent back to rule over the southern Deccan as amirs under the Delhi Sultanate, and who then took the opportunity when they met Vidyaranya to apostatize from Islam and found a kingdom of their own, which eventually became Vijayanagara. In yet another version, Vidyaranya is wandering around the hills of Hampi when he meets two shepherds, recognizes them as miraculous manifestations of the god Shiva Virupaksha, and then orders them to establish a city there. Now, it's very difficult to take all of these stories as anywhere near established fact, though there might be some elements of truth in them, which we'll get into later. The story of the hare chasing the hunting dogs is involved in the foundation of many South Asian cities, including the Sri Lankan city of Kandy. Much more important and insightful, just generally, is to kind of examine the fact that Vidyaranya appears in all these stories as a kind of preceptor and, more importantly, as an integral aspect of the foundation story of these Sangama brothers. From what we can tell, these Sangama brothers, there were five. There was Bukka, Harihara, a chap called Marappa, and two other obscure brothers whose names we are not totally sure of. These guys were basically ambitious warlords who at some point may have served as emirs representing Tughlaq authority south of the Krishna River. And as the Tughlaq empire began to roll up due to the policies of Muhammad bin Tughlaq and the incompetence of his successors, as well as the rise of this new Bahmani Sultanate, these men basically went on their own way. They fought very freely with other petty warlords, slowly eroded away the power of older established kingdoms such as the Hoysalas, who were well on their way out, and gradually began to carve out little kingdoms of their own. One of these kingdoms was in the area corresponding to modern Mysore. One of these was in the area corresponding to modern Pudukkottai. But eventually, these brothers together managed to establish their authority over a very wide swathe of southern India, which led to them butting heads with another very powerful group of people in southern India at the time, namely the Sri Vaishnavas. The Sri Vaishnavas were an orthodox religious sect who were mostly followed by elite high caste people, unlike another competing sect known as the Veerashaivas, who, while equally powerful and while they also had a very wide network of monasteries that were loyal to them, were more popular with lower caste people because they weren't really that big on caste hierarchies. But it seemed that for the Sangama brothers, an alliance with the Sri Vaishnavas made a lot of sense. Already in the early 14th century and perhaps in the late 13th century as well, this Mathadipati, this leader of a Matha called Vidyaranya, had been working with his brother to establish new commentaries of the Vedas and basically create a new assertive form of Hinduism that was more codified, very obviously a response to the trauma that was inflicted by seeing the success of a new religion that had been totally alien to the Deccan at this point, namely Islam. Now, Vidyaranya was enormously powerful. He seems to have had a great deal of influence. As a Mathadipati, he would have gone about on an elephant with drummers and an umbrella and musicians, just like any other king. And just as it made plenty of sense for Alauddin Bahman Shah to ally with the Sufi sheikhs because they legitimized his authority, it made plenty of sense for these new founders of this new kingdom, Vijayanagara, to ally with Vidyaranya and his Sri Vaishnavas as an integral aspect of their royal power. This alliance with the Sri Vaishnavas has very often led a lot of rather communally charged histories today to kind of cast the Sangama brothers and more generally Vijayanagara as some kind of Hindu empire, something that was hell-bent on the removal of Muslims and that existed primarily to safeguard the so-called Sanatana Dharma. That's a little difficult for us to wrap our heads around, especially given what we know of the chaos of the times, the turbulence of the times. Take, for example, the fact that in some origin stories of Vijayanagara, these men are just shepherds who eventually are recognized by Vidyaranya and go on to found a kingdom. Why shepherds? Because the Sangama brothers seem to have used the pastoralist peoples of the Deccan to be the backbone of the military. These pastoralist peoples would have been very well used to moving over wide areas of territory. They would have been used to a very difficult fighting life, a very hardy life that required them to constantly be in conflict and extract taxes from settled peoples. As such, they would have been very useful as military peoples, and you can see why the Sangama brothers would have wanted to cast themselves as basically former shepherds. But more insightful is this story of them at some point having been taken to Delhi, having converted to Islam, and having come back and converted back from Islam into Hinduism. Why does the story exist? Now, it's possible, as some people interpret it, that this was merely a calculation on their part, that this was merely them being smart, submitting to a powerful religion when they had to, and then reverting to the eternal Sanatana Dharma and defending it when they got a chance. But there are other ways to look at this. In fact, when the story first appears, it appears during the apogee of this new kingdom, Vijayanagara, and it's not told in ways that anyway reveal the Sangama brothers as having been ashamed or as having quote-unquote apostatized from Islam. Instead, what happens is that the Sultan is impressed by looking at these brothers' performance as military officers of the Kampila Rayas. The term that is used in the story is Satya Sadhana. So the Sultan is impressed by their trustworthiness, and he rewards them by giving them land in Karnataka and commands them to rule their new territory as loyal vassals of his. The language of this entire story does not tell us a story of religious conversion, but instead a kind of foundation myth of a new kind of state, an Indian state that traces the political authority of its founders to their supposed descent from the political structure of the Delhi Sultanate. Again, let me just emphasize this. It's a story of a South Indian kingdom where its rulers derive their authority to rule just as kings of old used to derive their authority from their supposed descent from great dynasties and great kings and great gods. a new South Indian kingdom that instead derives its authority from the fact that it was once a vassal of the Sultanate. And this can be seen in one of the earliest titles that these Sangama brothers adopt. They call themselves Hindu Raya Suratrana. What Hindu Raya Suratrana means is Sultan among Hindu kings. In fact, one of the Sangama brothers, a chap called Bukka, in some of his inscriptions, doesn't even call himself Sultan among Hindu kings. He simply calls himself Sultan. This tells us a lot of very interesting things about what these men saw themselves as. They did not really see themselves as restorers of some ancient Hindu religion that now needed to be protected from these evil Muslims. Rather, they saw themselves as members of a new political elite that kind of transcended boundaries, a political elite that was defined by sultans, these powerful kings who had these relations with powerful religious rulers who enjoyed absolute authority in the material domains. They derived a sense of identity from the fact that they were fighting against but also political equals to this new kingdom that had arisen in the Deccan, to this new kingdom that existed in Delhi that had conquered and subjugated the Deccan. And all of this tells us that when we try to understand these new states, when we try to understand the Bahmanis, when we try to understand Vijayanagara, it's important to leave aside our communal bias of Hindu versus Muslim and try to understand instead that in the chaos and turbulence of the times, as these men fought to establish a place for their own, they did not necessarily see themselves as agents of one religion or another, but rather as agents of something that was totally new, something that was totally their own, something that was exemplified by this new title.
Yes, Anirudh, the self-image of the Vijayanagara Empire as this underdog, or in this case, the hare or the rabbit, going after the hunting dog is really fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating self-conceptions of a state that I've come across in the early modern period. Also, the fact that they style themselves sultans suggests that this is a polity that was not necessarily harkening back to the old, but was really something new under the sun in the Deccan and in the subcontinent more broadly. What's also very interesting to me is where Harihara and Bukka decided to set up their capital. The choice of Vijayanagara actually reminds me a little bit of the choice of Delhi for the Delhi Sultanate. It's not a place with salubrious climate where you can maybe enjoy the summers. This is a very harsh place. Why did they choose it? Well, for one, of course, it was a pilgrimage site. But more importantly, Vijayanagara is very strategically located. It's protected on one side by the Tungabhadra River, and it's also ringed by these granite mountains, which can easily be reinforced by fortifications, which tend to funnel armies through fairly narrow gaps. And this new Vijayanagara Empire used these natural fortifications and the natural moat of the Tungabhadra River to create a new urban center.
It's very important once again to kind of emphasize that the Sangama brothers are not just your standard quote-unquote restorers of dharma. They are very, very intelligent strategists. They're very ambitious warlords. The reason why they have succeeded in this enormous field of claimants who have risen to kind of take advantage of the turbulence in the Deccan at this time is because these men understand strategy. They understand how to lead. Each of them has carved out a polity in their own right. Each of them is extracting money as basically a warlord from settled peoples in various parts of southern India. And they all choose to kind of get their resources together and funnel them into this new site of Vijayanagara for many reasons. One big reason, as Aditya said, was the fact that it's surrounded by all these granite outcrops. So by fortifying a few parts of these granite ridges, you can kind of leave only a very few openings so you can monitor everybody who's going in and coming out. So you can very easily kind of tax people. You can stop enemies on the way. But there's also other reasons that go into them choosing this site. The first is that for generations up to this point, I've come across inscriptions from the freaking 7th, 8th centuries which describe kings coming and visiting this area because it was a tirtha. A tirtha quite literally means a ford. It's where devotees are believed to be able to cross over from the material realm to the spiritual realm, just as they cross over from one bank of a river to another. This tirtha, where the city of Vijayanagara was founded, was known as the Pampa Tirtha because it was sacred to a fierce goddess known as Pampa Devi, who seems to have been a river deity of some kind, but also a very kind of violent and fierce goddess. We are told that devotees would offer their heads and limbs to her for success in battle. And it seems that this was a very important religious site, which eventually sought to associate itself with the more established Shaivite religion, and particularly the form of Shiva as Virupaksha. So they began to depict Pampa Devi as eventually a form of Parvati, and basically became a Shaivite holy site. Interestingly enough, this same site, where ford of Pampa, was associated with another legendary site called Kishkinda, which listeners who are familiar with the Ramayana may have heard of. This was supposedly the home of the Vanaras, the monkey people who this legendary god King Rama supposed to have befriended and used as soldiers in his wars against Lanka. So there's a lot of sacred and religious reasons why these brothers might have chosen that. We don't know, of course, how devout these men actually were, but definitely the fact that this is associated with a sacred site, the fact that you have pilgrims coming in, was also a big reason for them choosing to focus their resources and build a new city here. The final reason for the selection of this site called Vijayanagara was the fact that it's next to the Tungabhadra. So not only can the Tungabhadra be used as a moat, but you can also divert the Tungabhadra into channels and use it for irrigation. Already for centuries at this point, the Deccan had seen some fairly remarkable advances in irrigation technology. As I mentioned in the last episode, the Kakatiyas of Telangana were especially known for this, building many tanks that kind of collected rainwater and irrigated this dry land to make it agriculturally productive. Vijayanagara, this new center of Sangama power, was also built up into an agrarian center, not necessarily as fertile as other areas such as the Raichur Doab or the Tamil coast, but definitely enough to support a very hardy kind of population that was defended by all these granite outcroppings, that was defended by all these fortifications, that could very much act as a base for a new kind of polity for these people who wanted to go out and conquer as much of South India as they possibly could.
Absolutely. Even today, if you go to the old ruins of Vijayanagara and Hampi, you can see along the granite outcroppings the remnants of old walls. You can see evidence of the irrigation that they practiced. The other really striking thing to me about Vijayanagara is when you look at the territorial ambitions of this kingdom, it's clearly driven by material needs. The two areas that Vijayanagara looks to expand into and consolidate its power over are the Raichur Doab, which is the fertile strip of land formed between the Tungabhadra and Krishna rivers, and the Konkan coast on the west. And this, of course, brings them into direct conflict with the Bahmanis, the real superpower of the Deccan. Now, in its later propaganda, Vijayanagara may have projected itself as being the hare fighting the hunting dog, but really by the mid-14th century, Vijayanagara had grown some pretty sharp fangs of its own, and it was giving it back to the Bahmanis. If you look at the roughly 85-year period from about 1365 to 1450, I count 9 different wars. Now, obviously, this spans about 3 generations, so there are periods of peace, but it's really interesting that these two polities continue to clash and frequently continue to clash over the same areas, namely the Raichur Doab and the western coast. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of every single one of these wars, but I think it's quite interesting to look at some of the common features. One is that these wars frequently involved the taking of forts and sieges. While there were battles, often these battles also centered around a siege. Now, one reason that a lot of these campaigns centered around sieges was simply that Bahmanis at this time did have a major tactical advantage. And that is that they had access to war horses, and their armies were composed of men who rode those horses. So in a sense, they enjoyed the sort of tactical advantages that Turkic or nomadic armies had enjoyed in the subcontinent in earlier centuries as well. Now, this meant that fighting an open battle with the Bahmanis was not necessarily the smartest thing for Vijayanagara. And on the other hand, if you force them into a siege, things got a lot more difficult. Horses are basically useless in a siege. Sieges, like we've discussed before in this podcast, really start a ticking clock because you're extremely susceptible to disease. And on at least 2 occasions during these campaigns between 1365 and 1450, you see the Bahmanis having to lift a siege precisely because they see disease spreading through their ranks and their armies are actually devastated. So this is actually a fairly effective way for Vijayanagara to deal with a more powerful state.
If you recall what we were saying earlier about how the granite outcrops around Vijayanagara were basically used to kind of funnel enemy forces into choke points, it makes a lot of strategic sense, right? Because they're on the back foot against the Bahmanis, who have these highly mobile cavalry forces. Vijayanagara itself as a city is on the banks of the Tungabhadra river. So it's right next to the fertile Raichur Doab, which both these states are contesting. So Vijayanagara, by having this fortified citadel so close to this contested zone, is very easily able to funnel military forces in there and out if they're on the back foot. But at the same time, because it's so highly defended, for miles away, they can see enemies coming and channel them into choke points. It acts as the perfect kind of strategic location to maintain their grip over this fertile area.
Exactly, and that's what makes it very difficult for the Bahmanis to actually take Vijayanagara, even though they try to do exactly that. Now, as you might imagine, this siege warfare basically sets off an arms race between the Bahmanis and Vijayanagara, because both sides are trying to improve their own fortifications. So you actually see some fairly interesting innovations, some of which seem to be taken from the Middle East and possibly in later years even from Europe. You see these long curtain walls, you see angled bastions coming up. These are useful basically in deflecting missiles, whether they come from trebuchets or even cannons, because clearly these forts, with their thick walls, are not only meant to actually take punishment from catapults, they're also designed to be able to bear catapults of their own, which can in turn attack the enemy. And you also see by the 1450s the first signs of loopholes for cannons. So as early as the mid 15th century, you see some of the first cannons, possibly coming from the Ottoman Empire or Europe, being used in the Deccan. This is a period of actually fairly impressive military innovation centering around sieges and fortifications. Obviously, this sort of military innovation requires a lot of investment, and while the Bahmanis could invest in such fortifications, and the Vijayanagara could also do that to some extent, but these smaller states could actually wield a lot of influence in the grand struggle between the Bahmanis and Vijayanagara. You have the Vellama kingdom, you have the Reddys, and you have perhaps one of the most interesting polities at this time, which is the Madurai Sultanate. Now, if you're wondering how on earth a sultanate showed up in Madurai, in the Tamil country, this really dates back to the campaigns of Malik Gafur and of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. A man named Jalaluddin Ehsan Khan actually struck out for independence and carved out his own fiefdom in Madurai in 1335. Now, this sultanate was not a particularly stable polity. There was something like 8 different sultans during a 40-year-old period before it was finally extinguished by Vijayanagara, which is a fascinating story in itself.
As for how exactly this happened, as Aditya said, it is really quite an interesting story. The closest thing resembling a primary source that we have describing how exactly this happened is a very famous text called the Madhura Vijayam, which was written by this lady called Ganga Devi, who seems to have been a descendant of this ancient nobility of southern Karnataka, who now married into this upstart new dynasty of the Sangamas sitting in Vijayanagara. She was one of the women of the harem of the Vijayanagara Prince Kumara Kampana, who was the son of Bukka. Bukka was one of the very first Sangama brothers who established the kingdom. And now this Madhura Vijayam, or the victory over Madurai, begins with the Sangama king Bukka ordering his son Kumara Kampana to do something very interesting. What he tells his son is that he must burn down a tree that resists Vijayanagara authority in the Tamil country. This tree is described as having 2 parts. The Turushkas, the Turks, are the trunk, the prakanda of the tree, but it also has another part, namely its branches. Its branches are the Sambhavarayas. The Sambhavarayas are one of those tiny polities that Aditya mentioned. These guys are minor kings who basically ruled over the Tondai Mandalam, or broadly the northern part of the Tamil coast. And the Sambhavarayas, again, are just one of those tiny, interesting polities. The Sangama brothers had already come up against them in the previous generation. They're still fighting to establish their kingdom. But the first time they attacked them, they basically just vassalized them as any other Indian state did, forced them to basically pay them tribute and left them in place. But now, apparently, by the late 14th century, Bukka, the Vijayanagara emperor, was now more insistent on capturing the Tamil country. There is a compelling strategic reason for him doing that. As Aditya mentioned, one of the areas where Vijayanagara was constantly contesting Bahmani authority was in the Konkan. The Konkan, as it was connected to global trade networks, was enormously lucrative, and it was therefore a bone of contention for both these inland empires, which didn't have too much revenue that they could extract from agriculture. But the Tamil country, which the Bahmanis had no way of reaching, was a potential gold mine for Vijayanagara. If they could extend their control over the fertile coast, they could not only extract enormous revenues from global trade, but they could also potentially extract agrarian revenues from the fertile Kaveri River Delta, which is why Bukka insists that Kumara Kampana should defeat both the Sambhuvarayas and the Turushkas and quote-unquote burn down this metaphorical tree. There is nowhere here in this initial part of the Madhura Vijayam where Bukka says that these are Muslims and they must be extirpated, or these are Hindus and therefore they must be protected. As Aditya said, clearly Vijayanagara is a very new kind of state. These guys don't particularly care about our modern interpretations of their identity. They are much more interested in getting rich and getting powerful, just like any other of their contemporaries. So what exactly happens in the Madhura Vijayam? There's a number of very interesting literary devices that this lady Ganga Devi uses to kind of justify Vijayanagara's aggression in the Tamil country. The first, of course, is the way that she uses literary images to kind of draw this image of the Madurai Sultanate as being ruled by these absolute barbarians. At one point in his journey towards Madurai, Kumara Kampana has a dream where the goddess Meenakshi appears to him. Now, Meenakshi is a goddess that's associated with the much older Pandya royalty. Meenakshi gives him a sword which was supposedly Shiva's sword, which was once given to the Pandya kings. Once again, I'd like to emphasize this is not one of those curvy scimitars that often spring to mind when we think of ancient swords. This would have been one of those magnificent leaf-shaped blades that we see in hero stones from the time. Now, Meenakshi says that, hey, this is the sword of the god Shiva. I gave it to the Pandya king and he used it to defeat sinners and evildoers and establish order upon this world. And now I give you the sword of the Pandya king and I ask you to do the same thing. Because look at Madurai. Madurai once had temples resounding with drums and Brahmin settlements fragrant with incense and filled with the resounding Veda and gardens filled with coconut trees. But now its temples reverberate with the howls of jackals. The Brahmin settlements smell of raw meat and are filled with the battle cries of drunk Turushkas, and the gardens are filled with spears from which human skulls hang. It is a fairly graphic and very, very powerful image, right? But clearly what Ganga Devi is trying to say through the goddess Meenakshi is, hey, look, the Turks aren't defending the Dharma, but Vijayanagara is going to defend the Dharma. So you Tamils should really take us a lot more seriously. We're coming here to rescue you after all. It's filled with fairly racist stereotypes. She talks about parrots who are trained to speak Persian and compares them to owls who are howling. She makes fun of the Turks' physical features with their swinging braids, with intensely red eyes, with long beards, and what she calls fierce foreheads with dreadful brows. Now, again, why is Ganga Devi doing this? It might seem from one angle that she is basically declaring that Vijayanagara is exactly what a communally charged history would interpret them to be, as being this restorer of the Dharma. But that's not really borne out by the rest of the book. This one scene really does not define the entirety of Vijayanagara's view, as we can see. Much later on in the narrative, when Kumara Kampana actually gets into a battle with the Madurai Sultan, the warriors are describing as fighting together in all kinds of horrible ways, but also as appreciating each other's martial glory. There's one particularly interesting depiction of two warriors who are fighting, end up killing each other as enemies, and then ascend to heaven as friends, holding each other's arms and shoulders. Now, and most interestingly, in that particular passage, Ganga Devi does not make a distinction between Turushka and South Indian. She doesn't make a distinction between Hindu and Muslim. She very clearly is trying to depict them as both valiant warriors who are members of the same kind of martial culture. Most interestingly, of course, is when Kumara Kampana fights the Sultan himself. When the Sultan strings his bow, Ganga Devi says that the anklets of the goddess of valor, Jayashri, have returned to the Sultan. Again, that is a very interesting device for her to use. Very clearly, despite her racist depiction of these Turks as basically agents of sin and immorality, she also sees them very much as part of this violent military aristocratic culture. Definitely much uglier than the beautiful Vijayanagara people, but definitely in no way a subhuman, in no way barbaric, and definitely respected for their martial valor. This, I think, needs to be gone into. If you think of the political context in which Ganga Devi is saying this, the standard way for an Indian king to conquer a new territory is to establish a member of a pre-existing nobility as his vassal, and thereby be considered to be so generous and so powerful and so on and so forth. But what Vijayanagara are doing here is very different. They're very clearly out to establish an extractive new regime. They are not out to restore the Pandyas. Instead, what Ganga Devi is trying to do is project them as replacing the Pandyas because they are taking on the Pandya sword, but simultaneously as being righteous and as restoring the worship of Meenakshi and of various other gods, as a result of which they deserve to be ruling the Tamil kingdom. It's a very nuanced kind of propaganda tool, but of course we have to consider that people sitting in the 14th century aren't stupid. Just like us, they like to spin their own kind of histories. History is always written by the victor, and they like to justify what they're doing. So very soon after that, Kumara Kampana establishes, as I said, an extractive new regime. He establishes a new, what is called a Rajya, or basically a sub-province of the broader Vijayanagara Empire, which is centered around the great fortress of Chandragiri. In Chandragiri, he sets up a chap called Mangudeva, who later adopts the title of Saluva, which means hawk, because he watches like a hawk the Tamil countries and extracts money. He extracts a customs duty from the various parts of the Tamil country. And he also, of course, restores a few temples, restores worship and respects Brahmins. So very evidently what Vijayanagara, this upstart new parvenu elite is trying to do is try to cultivate the pre-existing elites of the Tamil country, circumvent the political elites, and instead adopt the religious route to legitimization, just as they did with Vidyaranya, and indeed just as the Bahmanis were doing with the Sufi sheikhs.
And Anirudh, just going back to Madhura Vijayam, what really fascinates me about what you just said is that it seems to represent a fairly complicated worldview. The text seems to have different ways of perceiving and communicating to the people whom Vijayanagar plans to rule, the people whom Vijayanagar plans to trade with, and the people whom Vijayanagar is fighting. So it's something that seems both simultaneously rooted in the sense that these people are very proud of who they are, yet at the same time they seem to understand that they exist in this fairly cosmopolitan world. This is not just the cosmopolitan world of the Deccan itself, which has so many cultures, so many languages, but also the trade networks, because both Vijayanagar and the Bahmanis at this time were linked to the Western Indian Ocean via the Konkan coast.
I think world of the Western Indian Ocean is really the perfect term, Aditya, because what we see really is that at this time, to a much greater extent than it ever has throughout any point in its history, the Deccan has now very, very deeply become part of this vast network of global trade that stretches across the entirety of the Eurasian landmass. And to a great extent, this enormous network of many, many peoples, many traders, many different architectural, literary styles, languages, religions, had really kind of solidified into what we can call a single world system. Many of the horrific traumas that we see around the turn of the first millennium are by now kind of receding into the background. The terrible explosions of the Turkic and Mongol peoples that profoundly shaped the world are now subsiding as these nomadic peoples now become part once again of this great Eurasian network. From all the way in the Netherlands, you see this network of trade that connects it to Spain, connects Spain to Africa, that connects Africa to France, to Italy, that connects Italy to the Balkans, that connects the Balkans to Anatolia, to Turkey, to Egypt, to the Persian Gulf, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Persia, to the great fields of grass of Central Asia, and of course the enormous Indian subcontinent far, far beyond into Southeast Asia and China. All these people once again are trading, once again are starting to travel, once again are starting to kind of emerge into the light of history with these fascinating travelers' accounts that survive from this time. It is a time of war that, of course, is endemic to the human condition, it seems. But it's also a time of great innovation. Aditya mentioned the Ottoman Empire earlier as being one of the trading partners of the Bahmanis. The Ottoman Empire was among the states that were really pushing the boundaries in terms of what gunpowder could achieve. In 1453, which was roughly around the same time that Vijayanagara and the Bahmanis were still going at it in the Raichur Doab, the Ottomans had managed to cast a cannon of such size that they were able to break down the walls of Constantinople, the former capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the walls of which had stood for nearly 1,000 years, and managed to turn that city into what it is still called today, Istanbul. We also see the eruption of the Turco-Mongol warlord Timur, also known as Tamerlane, Timuri Lenk, who invaded northern India, brutally sacked Delhi, and led to the fading of the Delhi Sultanate's authority in much of northern India and the establishment of many new sultanates, including in Malwa and in Gujarat. But you also see the Mongols now really settling down and becoming truly a sedentary people. An independent Mongol dynasty called the Yuan rules in China. A Mongol dynasty called the Ilkhans have settled down in Persia, where they're overseeing this blossoming of Persianate literature, of Persianate architectural styles. The same calls to Allah are being repeated from as far away as the spectacular palaces and mosques and gardens of Spain, to the enormous imposing mosques and towers and minarets of Egypt, to the slowly restored libraries of Baghdad, to the turquoise minarets and mosques that you see in Timurid Central Asia. You really see a flowering of trade, of curiosity, movements of people. The Crusades are over. The great wars that left much of northern India and Persia and Iraq in anarchy are over. And once again, it seems to be a time for innovation. It's a very new kind of age. And Vijayanagara sees itself very much as part of this age. It sees itself as being an absolutely modern, cosmopolitan state that is connected to all these great global networks. And just as we, in the modern day, don't see a contradiction between worshipping gods at home and then putting on a suit and going and speaking English in a business meeting, Vijayanagara saw absolutely no contradiction between its continued worship and donation to temples and donations to Hindu deities and support for Orthodox Hindu institutions, and also taking on very interesting new aspects of this kind of globalized Islamicate world that it found itself in. One great example can be seen in the temple of Lepakshi, which was built in the later Vijayanagara period, but which shows us these fascinating depictions of what Vijayanagara courtiers actually looked like. These men are not wearing your standard South Indian dhoti, and there is no sign of a sacred thread or anything on them. Instead, they're wearing what is called a kabai, which is this long flowing white tunic, which is clearly inspired by Persianate models. So this is something that has like nice sleeves, can reach either up to the knees or perhaps even a little lower, and is sometimes printed with patterns. They also wear these beautiful brocade caps, which can be made of anything from velvet to silk to cotton cloth. And they also wear jewelry. And this kind of outfit, let me tell you, would not have been out of place in any other Islamicate court. It would not have been out of place in the Bahmani court. It would not have been out of place in the Timurid court. In fact, an ambassador from Timur himself, a chap called Abdur Razak, is recorded to have visited Vijayanagara at this time. He visits both Kozhikode, where he meets the Zamorin, and is quite surprised because the Zamorin, who is a relatively minor king but is still fairly important by Indian standards, is just sitting around wearing a lungi and like a lot of jewelry and very elaborate headgear, but is not very opulently dressed otherwise. Whereas when Abdur Razak goes to Vijayanagara, this very new, very vibrant new polity, he is very, very impressed by the fact that the Vijayanagara emperor wears a kabai and a kurlai, which is this towering kind of cylindrical hat, and says this man speaks and is as civilized and as educated and is as well-mannered as anybody else in the Islamicate world. Once again, we might think that this is an indication that Vijayanagara thought of itself as somewhat inferior to these new Islamicate cultures that they were in contact with. But I would caution us against that kind of assumption. As I said earlier, just as there is no contradiction for us sitting and wearing a dhoti or a t-shirt and shorts at home and putting on a suit for business meetings, because we're part of this broader westernized, globalized conception of how it is appropriate to appear in public, there is no contradiction for Vijayanagara between worshipping Hindu gods, supporting Hindu monasteries, but also adopting elements of this new globalized Islamicate trading world that they see themselves as part of. In fact, a very interesting metaphor to kind of think of this is through that goddess Pampa Devi, who I mentioned earlier. Now, one might ask themselves, one might think, look, Pampa Devi is a local river goddess, and clearly she was worshipped as a very fierce deity in her own right. Why is it that when Pampa Devi is now associated with a new religion of Shaivism, when she is now being described as a wife of Shiva, does that imply some kind of contradiction? Does that imply some kind of lessening of her status? Does that imply that the people of the Pampa Tirtha saw themselves as somewhat inferior to this new Sanskritic culture, that they needed to kind of cast their goddess in this new form? I would say no. just as a Southeast Asian king might adopt new elements of this kind of Indic trading world, this kind of Sanskritic world in which he finds himself in order to build kind of Indian temple architecture, import Indian Brahmins, and start to call himself with names like Suryavarman and so on and so forth. Just as this does not depict any acceptance from the Southeast Asian peoples that Indian culture is superior to theirs, but rather a new kind of globalized culture that they want to be part of because it comes with so much wealth and so much prestige. So it is with Vijayanagara and with Islam. So it is with ancient Indian tribal deities and their cult slowly accepting elements of this broader kind of Sanskritic cosmopolitan culture. Just as modern people have a complicated sense of identity which takes in these elements from various different cultures, various different traditions, but somehow, even though these might seem contradictory, they seem perfectly natural to us. The identity of the Vijayanagara elite was similarly complicated, similarly had many, many different elements which might seem contradictory to us, which we might be tempted to reduce into these incompatible black and whites. But to Vijayanagara themselves, they saw themselves as the most modern people. They saw themselves as the most sophisticated and modern and natural people for being able to integrate all these various different forms of identity just as we do today. And this, I think, is the real way in which we should see titles such as Hindu Raya Surutrana, the Sultan among Hindu kings. Not only is Sultan being seen as equivalent to a Maharaja Dhiraja or a great king among kings, as Indian emperors once used to call themselves, Sultan is also seen as being a label of participation within a new globalized world into which this new globalized state finds itself. There is no better example, of course, of Vijayanagara participating in this globalized world than the unsung architect of Vijayanagara's imperial power, as the American historian Bertenstein calls him, a chap called Devaraya II. Now, what Devaraya II does is he kind of solidifies this Vijayanagara policy of conquering the ports of the western coast, manages to establish authority over much of the Konkan. He also invites a large number of Muslim mercenaries to join the Vijayanagara military. If you look at the archaeological remnants of Vijayanagara today, in what is called the urban core, towards the eastern edge of it, there appears to have been what was called a Muslim quarter. There was a mosque there. There were graves there. So clearly, Muslims are not thought of as pariahs. In fact, if anything, they are clearly given a very honored part in the urban core, not too far from the royal palace. Devaraya also embarks on a series of other very important military reforms. One of the big things that he does, as I mentioned, is kind of open up Vijayanagara to these more cosmopolitan, globalized influences. I mentioned this Timurid ambassador Abdul Razak earlier. The Vijayanagara king of which Abdul Razak spoke so highly was none other than Devaraya II himself. Devaraya also implemented a series of military reforms which kind of decentralized power from the Sangama monarch to a number of generalissimos, one among which was a chap called Saluva Narasimha. Now, Saluva Narasimha was a descendant of the same family of so-called hawks who ruled from Chandragiri and who had a great deal of power in the Tamil country. These generalissimos that Devaraya gave so much power to were what were called Nayakas. Nayakas are basically, in some ways, a Vijayanagara analog to the Muslim emir. These guys rule over a particular area of land. They pay a certain amount of tax to the central power, and in return, they can enjoy the rest of the revenue themselves and they can raise their own armies. This is very similar to the Iqta system that the Delhi Sultanate was using. It's very similar to the system that contemporary Orissa was using. It's very similar to what the Bahmanis were using. And of course, it's very similar to much older pre-existing Indian military aristocratic traditions. Unlike pre-existing Indian traditions, which generally involved one political center extending its military authority and raising up local chiefs and making them part of its political network, what Vijayanagara does is new in the sense that it instead uses a totally new aristocracy, very often composed of like these Telugu peasant warriors, many of whom have migrated south from the ruins of the Kakatiya kingdom, and makes them basically governors or viceroys who are not necessarily answerable to the center of power, but who act as basically semi-independent kings in their own right. All of these reforms made Vijayanagara's military profoundly powerful. We are told that very rapidly Vijayanagara's military became far more effective. It certainly had a large number of cavalry archers, some very effective foot archers as well, which enabled them to kind of pry large swathes of the Raichur Doab away from the Bahmani Sultanate. A later Deccani historian, a chap by the name of Firishta, who is one of the closest things we have resembling a primary source, but is also one of the most unreliable sources about the period, claims that the reason for Vijayanagara's success was the fact that they were now employing Muslim soldiers. I think that's definitely part of it, but one must also remember that Ferishta, as a Muslim historian, always goes out his way to kind of make Muslims seem like the most militarily capable of all the peoples of the Deccan at this time, which wasn't necessarily the case. But it definitely seems that by importing like new kind of global talent, and most importantly by connecting himself to global trade networks and importing very large numbers of superior war horses from the West, some of which would have been raised in Central Asia, some of which would have come from Central Asia to the great Persian city of Shiraz, where, as we remember, one of the early Sufi sheikhs who supported Bahmani authority was from. And from there, through the Persian Gulf, and of course, through Socotra and through Yemen and Oman as well, Devraya built up this very large, very new kind of South Indian army, very mobile, very effective, very capable of hitting enemy weak points and like extending authority over a wide range of territory and fighting back these much more mobile Bahmani forces on their own terms.
And one consequence of this far more powerful Vijayanagara military is that the Bahmanis also really have to up their game. A little earlier, Anirudh was talking about Madhura Vijayam, the text written by Ganga Devi, and how the propaganda in that text works. You also mentioned Farishta. It's useful over here to go into some of the propaganda that Farishta also engages in, because both Ganga Devi and Farishta are elites who are writing for very specific audiences in their time, in their context, and their texts are very politically loaded. They're meant to achieve certain political objectives. They're meant to appeal to or appease the right people, which is why when we read them today, we can't just take them literally or decontextualize them, because that ends up being very misleading. One example of this, which ties into this whole changing military balance, is when Farishta recounts the campaigns of 1365 between the Bahmanis and Vijayanagara. And at one point he mentions that the great Sultan, Muhammad Bahman Shah, killed 70,000 infidels in the Raichur Dawab. Now, this sounds horrific and some sort of slaughter may well have taken place. But what's interesting is what Farishta says later. He gives us this very dramatic account of these Vijayanagara ambassadors who came to the Sultan and appealed to him not to harm unarmed people, not to kill civilians. And the Shah, in all his magnanimity and wisdom, agreed. It's very hard for us to figure out what to make of this. On the one hand, Farishta does seem to be justifying restraint in warfare in the 16th century, at the time he was writing and for the audience he was writing, and trying to put that in context. However, this could also refer to real events. There may well also have been some sort of diplomatic parleying that maybe helped change the way that war was conducted in the Deccan. But to me, it's hard to imagine that any such change would have taken place if we had not seen an increase in Vijayanagara's own power. Now, Anirudh has gone over how Devaraya introduced cavalry archers into the Vijayanagara army. The impact of this can't be understated, because now Vijayanagara could do what the Bahmanis used to do. They can raid, they can harass, they can move forces from one place to another really quickly, and so gain numerical superiority in places where they need to have it. This changes the dynamics of battles and open warfare, and the Bahmanis know immediately that they have to up their game. And some of the key changes the Bahmanis actually make during this time are actually administrative. And you can see the Bahmanis doing the same things that other states were doing in the early modern period, whether in India or even elsewhere, for example, in Europe, which is that they were centralizing authority, often at the expense of more provincial seats of power. So one of the most obvious examples of this is that in the early days, a lot of the Bahmani forts used to be administered and provisioned and even manned locally. The operations of these forts were almost entirely centralized. Even the running of the Bahmani army was greatly centralized. The central state, ruling out of either Gulbarga or later Bidar, became responsible for salaries for soldiers, for equipping, for maintenance of their equipment. And as a direct consequence, they also became responsible for the upgradation of these forts. And you can see an example of this in the fort at Bidar, which is a later capital of the Bahmanis. The fort has 3 full layers of fortifications. There's a lower city, an upper city, and a citadel as well. And the gates in the lower city have barbicans, which are these outer defenses around each of them, which makes it very difficult for those gates to be breached in the very first place. What's really interesting is that the gates in the lower city's walls, the outermost walls, have barbicans around them. What are barbicans? Barbicans are basically walled outposts that surround a gate. So you're only able to approach the gate from one side or maybe two sides. You do see barbicans in a lot of Indian fortifications throughout the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. What a barbican does is it makes it really difficult for someone to easily breach that gate. A gate is one of the weaker parts of any fortification. And a barbican, to a great extent, really solves that problem because you can't use catapults, trebuchets, or even cannons against that gate effectively because it's shielded by this thick wall. As if that were not enough, the fort also had a triple moat. Its bastions were fairly sturdy and strong, and so could bear the weight of large catapults. And it also had maculations, which are basically openings that allowed defenders to drop or throw unpleasant things at the attackers. This could be, for example, incendiary devices. And so any prospective attacker of this fort would be exposed to fire or to showers of arrows at any time. And so attacking the fort would be extremely unpleasant. Now, what this sort of fortification that is not just so expensive, but is so up to date suggests to us is that the Bahmanis at this time were attracting the very best talent. In this case, we could very clearly see the civil engineering talent or the military engineering talent of planning and building such formidable fortifications. Now, this sort of centralization not only requires greater revenue collection, but it also requires what we would now call state capacity. The Bahmanis just needed a lot more talented people, and these talented people were not necessarily available locally. So just like Devaraya II imported Muslim cavalrymen from elsewhere, the Bahmanis were absolutely eager to get foreign talent from across the seas, from the broader Islamic world. And who were these people? They were scholars, they were soldiers, they were administrators. And where did they come from? They came from the broader Persianized world. So this would be people from Persia itself. These would be Arabs who are very Persian in their culture. This would be people from Central Asia who are very Persian in their culture. And as these people came into the Bahmani Sultanate, as they were welcomed into it, embraced, given power, they created a power center of their own. And guess what happens? The existing nobility, the existing power structure is very concerned about this. And this existing power structure consisted both of Turks, who by then would have been very Indianized, as well as locals. So you have this existing well-entrenched, established faction of Indian Muslims, highly Indianized Turks on the one hand, and these new parvenus coming in who seem to be getting favorable treatment from the sultans. And this ends up really creating a fundamental cleavage within the Bahmani Sultanate, because you suddenly have a division among the elites. And this conflict between the new incoming Persian speakers and the existing Deccani elites would end up becoming a fundamental fault line on which the Bahmani Sultanate would eventually splinter. But that is sometime in the future. And it's useful at this point to actually consider the career of perhaps one of the most extraordinary of these Persian immigrants, a man named Mahmud Gawan. Gawan and the world that he inhabited are so interesting that we actually got the historian Manu Pillai to tell us more. And here's what he had to say.
So Mahmud Gawan was in many ways one of those perfect representatives of the kind of talent and ability that the Deccan attracted from Persianate lands towards the west, which includes not just Iran, but also Iraq, places as far as Georgia, and of course, military slaves who were imported from Africa via these Islamic networks into the Deccan. Now, Gawan, in his case, he not only wore multiple hats, but frankly, each of these hats had multiple feathers in it. So already in the 1450s, when he first arrives in the Deccan, he's a trader, and he's already a man who's approaching middle age. He's in his 40s by that time. And it's essentially with, slaves and textiles and, all kinds of goods that he's come to the Deccan to essentially turn a profit. That's his intention. But Gawan is also a highly educated man. He's been educated in Syria, he studied in Egypt, he's got family networks that are spread across different countries, and he's clearly part of an elite sort of society where it's not just, trade for the sake of trade, but also the cultivation of personality and character and things like that. He kept up, all his life, a very heady correspondence with a number of senior figures, intellectuals, political leaders in different countries, all of which point at a certain versatility, a certain broadness of experience and intellectual depth. Now, he comes here originally as a merchant. The Bahmani court sort of welcomes him because they recognize talent when they see it. And in his case, because it's so obvious that this is a gifted man, he sort of rises fairly quickly in the service of the Bahmani state. So although he's a merchant initially, and although he continues more or less along that line, he also becomes part of the state's nobility and climbs the ladder, as it were. And it's interesting that there's no clear bifurcation between these two domains, because the Deccan is so closely welded with these trading networks across the Arabian Sea. It was very easy for a merchant to become a nobleman, and noblemen to have investments and trade and things like that. That was just how the court structure itself was designed. And it would become even more pronounced under Gawan, because he becomes, by the early 1460s, he becomes essentially the prime minister of the state, because as a minority, he's on the Regency Council, and then he eventually becomes the major advisor and force in the state. He leads military expeditions towards Orissa. He conquers Goa. He's sort of constantly importing military men, artillery men, talent like that for strategic purposes from Persia, from the Islamic world. At the same time, he's also bringing in all kinds of administrative reforms. So, for instance, he's realized that the way nobility has sort of split up different territories within the empire could tomorrow threaten the empire itself. And he starts sort of centralizing the administration, checks the power of these governors and nobles, and essentially, creates a sort of system of checks and balances to ensure that the state is never threatened. The Bahmanis are never actually threatened by any of their governors starting to act recalcitrant. Even as he does this, he's also dealing with another problem, which is that constant tussle between different factions at court. And these officially have ethnic sort of justifications. So we have, of course, the locals, or the Dakhnis, as it were, who claimed that, they were sons of the soil and they had a higher claim on the resources of the Bahmani Empire. Then you have these talented imported characters in court, including Gawa himself, who were all Westerners, Afakis, foreigners who had come from Persia. And because of their access to Persianate high culture, because of their access to these wider networks, they were treated with extraordinary and perhaps disproportionate regard by the court itself. And of course, there's an emerging sort of faction of the African Habshis. There's a faction of, the Marathas are slowly coming to their own, but they are not yet important factors in the system. Now, Gawan tries his best to sort of reconcile these two. And we must realize that, although there is this ethnic divide or cultural divide between these two groups, we shouldn't overstate it, because even though they were Dakhnis, they were also very much seduced by Persianate culture. So we shouldn't overstate the case that somehow the Dakhnis were completely divorced from these larger forces around them, and that Gawan fell a victim to these intrigues because he seemed entirely to be a Westerner and didn't see or recognize the rights and aspirations of the locals or the Dakhnis. What is more likely is that, his attempt to centralize the administration, his attempt to cut down the power of the nobles, etc. And of course, in addition, just one of several factors, the fact that he was a Westerner. All of these probably combined to put him at a disadvantage eventually, in terms of a lot of people conspiring against him. The very fact that the Sultan, quickly accepted the charge that he had been conspiring, which was of course a completely fake charge. It was done using his seal. His seal was, his seal bearer was got to drink a lot by a bunch of people. The seal was taken and affixed to a blank paper, after which they sort of entered details in it and crafted a seditious letter. But the very fact that the Sultan fell for it is an attempt perhaps to show that, Gawan was probably overpowerful. Even the Sultan resented the kind of influence Mahmud Gawan had by that time. And in 1481, the man is executed, and you can really date the decline of the Bahmani state from that time.
The Bahmani Sultanate might have been collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, but that doesn't mean that Vijayanagara necessarily was doing that much better. As I mentioned much earlier, Devaraya II had a policy by which he allowed his military men to basically do whatever they want, extract revenues as they wished, and basically raise armies to fight their own challengers as they wished. This policy was already starting to shake the foundations of Vijayanagara by the end of Devaraya II's reign. In fact, we are told by this Timurid ambassador, Abdul Razak, that there was an attempt on Devaraya's life which was led by one of his cousins. And gradually, in this kind of anarchy that began to descend upon the Vijayanagara Empire, as the Sangama family tried to tear itself apart, as many different cousins and nephews and uncles all fought for the throne, none of which who managed to keep it for a lot of time, there was opportunity that was created for many, many other powers. Now, in the years leading up to this, Vijayanagara's grip on southern India was by no means secure. In fact, the very existence of documents such as the Madura Vijayam tells us that Vijayanagara had a need to appeal to many, many elites of many different languages, many different caste backgrounds, many different occupational backgrounds. In fact, it wasn't just the Tamils, but also Vijayanagara's northeastern frontier that was constantly restive. The Raichur Doab wasn't the only area where they were in trouble with the Bahmanis. The kingdoms of the Reddys and Velamas, who ruled broadly the Krishna Godavari Delta, were absolutely insistent that they would not become subordinate to Vijayanagara, and fought many, many vicious and prolonged campaigns against them, into which the Bahmanis and very often this very powerful new kingdom known as the Gajapatis of Orissa were often drawn into. Now, I alluded a little earlier to the fact that Nayakas, this military officer class of the Vijayanagara Empire, was by no means original, and in a lot of ways kind of parallels the Ikta system with Amirs of the Delhi Sultanate, and also parallels the Nayakas of Orissa. Now, Nayakas as a title first emerged in Orissa as far as we know, because Orissa was constantly facing threats from multiple Muslim kingdoms, not just from the Delhi Sultanate, but also from Delhi's more restive younger brother, the Bengal Sultanate. Now, the Bengal Sultanate had a very complicated relationship with Delhi. Very often, more powerful Delhi Sultans would successfully manage to conquer Bengal, like Alauddin Khilji did. But more often than not, Bengal was more or less its own kind of independent province, and the primary target of its aggression very often was its southern neighbor, the Kingdom of Orissa. Now, because of this constant pressure from the Bengal Sultanate, but also because of the fact that you also have the hills and forests of Chhattisgarh kind of protecting its flanks, Orissa was more successful than most Indian kingdoms at that time in actually fighting off Sultanate forces, and kind of implemented this highly militarized kind of state society, where just like Vijayanagara raised up this new class of people to basically serve as its military officers, so too did Orissa. And Orissa first establishes a very, very large number of Nayakas and successfully keeps the Sultanates at bay for quite a while. That, of course, by no means indicates that Orissa was necessarily friendly to other quote-unquote Hindu kingdoms like Vijayanagara. As I said, identities at this time were shifting, they were complex, and most kings were interested, just as the Bahmanis and Vijayanagara were, in maximizing their power. One great example is a chap called Kapilendra Gajapati. Kapilendra was the descendant of one of these early Nayakas of Orissa and overthrew the reigning Orissa king of the Chodaganga dynasty, and instead established his own, which he called the Suryavamshis, which again is him claiming to be descended from the sun, which should be taken just about as seriously as Vijayanagara's tale of being founded because a hare chased a hunting dog. Now, because of the kind of entanglements that Vijayanagara got into in its northeastern frontier, where you had these Reddy kingdoms who were basically led by these peasant chieftains, you had the Velama kingdoms also led by peasant chieftains, who basically tried to play off the Bahmanis against Vijayanagara, against Orissa. This doesn't work out too well for them, as you can imagine, because these much larger, much more powerful empires just basically get all up in their business and totally smash them to pieces. But every now and then, whenever there is a weak kind of central authority in any one of these kingdoms, you will see that this region becomes more restive and another power will kind of swoop in to take control. Now, towards the ending of Devaraya II's reign, in the anarchy that began to engulf Vijayanagara due to the Sangama family's internal conflicts, Kapilendra Gajapati seizes opportunity and begins to push south down the Krishna River on India's east coast and starts to threaten Vijayanagara's Tamil territories. This proves to be the spark that would light a fire that would totally transform the Vijayanagara Empire, as a new generalissimo, who I alluded to earlier, a chap called Saluva Narasimha, a descendant of the same Saluva Mangudeva, who was a companion of the Vijayanagara prince Kumara Kampana, rises to power. Now, in the years up to this point, the Saluva family had been building up their resources through control of the revenue streams that were coming into Tamil Nadu. They didn't necessarily rule it, but Vijayanagara officers were taken quite seriously and had considerable authority. This is not to say, of course, that the Tamils exactly enjoyed having this extractive regime imposed upon them. In fact, we are told that in 1429, 1430, there was a peasant rebellion where both the right hand and left hand castes of the Tamil country got together to rise up against Vijayanagara. And this only ended when the Vijayanagara officers agreed to treat both right hand and left hand castes at the same level, which is a very interesting example of peasant revolt and of like an empire kind of being almost brought to its knees and accepting what the peasants are demanding. It's not something you very often see being well attested in Vijayanagara history, which you see very well attested in Indian history. But just here's one interesting example of that. Now, what Salva Narasimha does is that he gradually extends his authority from his family fort of Chandragiri deeper into Tamilakam. He begins to patronize Tamil goddesses such as Andal, and more importantly, the famous temple site of Tirupati, which was home to the god Venkateshwara. Now, Venkateshwara remains to this day one of the most popular and wealthy gods in India. The importance of his cult really can be traced back to the Vijayanagara times, and specifically to Salva Narasimha's attempts to kind of keep his Tamil populations happy by lavishing patronage upon a god that was very popular among the Tamils. So what Salva Narasimha does is he not only patronizes these gods, but he gradually begins to send his officers to take control of swathes of the fertile Tamil coast, of fertile Tamil agrarian land, and becomes easily one of the richest and most powerful men in Vijayanagara. And while central authority is weakened, this man rises up, manages to smash the Orissar invasions down the eastern coast, and then marches into Vijayanagara and declares himself to be the new emperor. And I think at this point it's worth once again talking about the fact that Vijayanagara had many deep ethnic divides, just as the Bahmani Sultanate did. Not only here do we see a Kannada lord taking over the Tamil land, but he does it using Telugu officers. These Telugu officers, who I said had migrated down from the collapse of the Kakatiyas. So there's many histories, many peoples that are constantly striving to be at the forefront of Vijayanagara politics. And very often, even in Vijayanagara's temples, we kind of see a reflection of this kind of plurality and this kind of diversity in the origin stories of its many peoples. One great example is the fact that a god known as Mylar was extremely popular in Vijayanagara. Now, some of the earliest instances we have of this god Mylar are from the Hoysala period, where he is a god of tribes, he's a god of pastoralists, so very much a god who's outside the pale of established religions such as the Sri Vaishnava religion, which is ostensibly one of the backbones of Vijayanagara imperial power. And we are also told that at this time, Mylar was popular among many peoples, including, and this is very important, including Muslims. So clearly, even religion at this time was nowhere near as black and white as we are told. It is not just the kings who are adopting a policy of general kind of religious pragmatism and like building an elite class that is composed of many people, many religious groups, but these seem to be born out of a much deeper kind of syncretism and intermingling that was happening between the Turkic and Indic peoples, where you have gods who have authority across both religions, sheikhs who have authority across both religions. And really, I think even the term both religions is a bit of a misnomer, because at this point it's this kind of binary that we're used to thinking of in terms of Hindu and Muslim doesn't really exist. The way that Hinduism and Islam work at this time are very different from the way that Hinduism and Islam work today. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we're thinking about Vijayanagara and the Sultanates. Now, I said Sultanates, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to bring us back to what is happening north of the Krishna River, where the Bahmanis are in the process of collapsing, and all of their nobles are in the process of going their own way. Just as Vijayanagara is starting to establish a new kind of imperial system, which has much more authority granted to its subordinate lords, where the extraction of trading revenue, where the use of cavalry is playing a much bigger role. Similarly, momentous changes are happening north of the Krishna River as Bahmani authority fades.
And speaking of sultanates, it's important that we now mention them in plural, because as Manu Pillai recounted, the death of Mahmud Gawan fundamentally disturbed the equilibrium of the Bahmani Sultanate. The conflict between the Deccanese on the one hand and the foreigners, the Persians on the other, blew over, and the Sultanate just began to splinter in no time. The man who succeeded Gawan was a Deccani named Nizamul Mulk, and his ascension to power immediately pushed the foreigner Yusuf Adil Khan to go set up his own power base in Bijapur. This led another Deccani, Imadul Mulk, to set up his own Jagir in Berar, and so on and so forth, because this in turn caused another one of those Persians, Qasim Barid, to go and take over in Bidar. And this in turn caused another Deccani, the son of Nizamul Mulk, to take over a Jagir in Maharashtra. And so you have this almost comical action reaction in which a Deccani takes over, which causes a foreigner to leave, which causes another Deccani to leave, which causes another foreigner to leave. And the consequence of this is that you have 5 successor states. All of these states inherit a lot of the characteristics of the Bahmani Sultanate. They're cosmopolitan, they're complex, they continue to draw talent from elsewhere. They trade with each other, they trade with the wider Islamic world. But there's one sultanate among these, that of Bijapur, another city of victory, that will rise to prominence again. And yet this dissolution and this rise of Bijapur would come as yet another disruptive force was entering the Deccan. This force would come from far off, on large ocean-going vessels, bristling with cannons, and powered by large sails. The strange-looking men on board these vessels would establish an empire of their own on the seas. They were the Portuguese, and they would bring a frightening new energy into a Deccanate war.
If you like Yuddha, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast app.
Yuddha is made possible by support from the Takshashila Institution and the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation. And your goodwill makes it possible for us to keep going.
If there's anything you'd like to learn about India's vibrant, violent military history, reach out to us on Twitter or Instagram. I'm Anirudh Kanesetti, that's ANIRUDH KANISETTI.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan, that's ADITYA RAMANATHAN. And while you're at it, don't forget to check out other interesting shows on the IVM Podcast Network.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.